Paleontology isn't exactly a walk in the park. You're basically playing detective with nothing but a pile of old bones to go with. Most of the time, those fossils are smashed to bits, or they've been sitting in the ground for hundreds of millions of years. Usually, it's a mix of both disasters, so calling this job difficult is putting it mildly. It's no surprise, then, that experts have dropped the ball a few times throughout history. Sure, mostly it's minor stuff, like guessing an animal was slightly bigger than it actually was. But every now and then, you get a blunder that's absolutely massive. We're talking mistakes so huge, they rewrite the textbooks and leave everyone confused, perfectly illustrated by these 7 creatures. Our first contender is a pretty forgivable error, honestly, largely because it involves the very first dinosaur ever formally named, the Megalosaurus. This Jurassic beast was written up way back in 1824, a time when our knowledge of prehistoric life was basically zero. To give you some context, the word dinosaur hadn't even been coined yet. So, naturally, the early sketches of what this thing looked like were, well, let's just say they were rough. The original specimen was just a thigh bone, some spinal fragments, and a piece of a jaw, all analyzed by an English scientist named William Buckley. His best guess? He'd found himself a gigantic, flesh-eating lizard. He assumed it walked on all fours, mostly because, in his mind, if a lizard is that big, it obviously can't stand up. On top of that, he figured the creature was amphibious, hanging out in the water like a crocodile rather than walking on land. And he estimated the living animal would have been over 40 feet, or 12.2 meters
roughly
long. But the story gets better. A rival researcher soon dug up a dinosaur bone that was even bigger, which apparently sparked a bit of professional jealousy, because Buckland suddenly decided his original size estimate was too modest. He couldn't let his lizard look small, so he inflated the numbers, claiming it was actually a staggering 70 feet or 21 meters long. You also have to remember that this discovery happened when religion still had a tight grip on science, and researchers often tried to make fossils fit their faith. In this specific instance, Christian doctrine was a hurdle for Buckland, since the prevailing belief was that death and pain didn't exist until Adam and Eve committed the original sin. The bones, however, clearly belonged to a predator. That meant something was killing things before humans existed. So Buckland came up with some impressive mental gymnastics. He argued the Megalosaurus wasn't a cruel killer. Instead, he claimed it was a benevolent population controller that only ate old and sick animals to reduce overall suffering, thereby keeping the concept of original sin intact. No, I am not making that up. Obviously, that theory was a stretch, as was most of his description, but over time, the real picture of this theropod started to come into focus. Ironically, the corrections didn't come from studying Megalosaurus itself, but from finding other, more complete theropod fossils. Scientists eventually realized this wasn't a 4-legged crawler. It stood upright on 2 legs. It also wasn't a swamp dweller. It was a fully land-based hunter. We also know now that Buckland's size estimates were way off. The animal was about half the length he claimed and weighed just over 1 ton. That's still a heavy hitter, though, easily making it the top dog of Middle Jurassic England. But Megalosaurus wasn't the only victim of early scientific guessing games.
Marked here as 1,
Plenty of dinosaurs
2,
got the same
and 3.
treatment, though accuracy improved as the decades rolled on. That doesn't mean the errors stopped, though. They still happen today, and not just with dinosaurs, but with creatures that are still around in some form, like spiders. Jump forward to the 1980s, and a scientist in Argentina found a bizarre fossil in the Bajo de Valles Formation. The rock dated all the way back to the Carboniferous period. It showed a massive shell, 3 legs, and body segments features that looked exactly like what you'd see in modern creepy crawlies. Based on the silhouette alone, the researcher was convinced he'd discovered an ancient arachnid, but this was one that shattered every record in the
round,
book.
fossilized
It was a
beetle
total
surface.
nightmare, measuring
The earthy red
34
and rusty
centimeters,
gray tones
or
clarified
13.3 inches in length. That's bigger than the Goliath bird eater, which, until that moment, held the crown for the largest spider in history. The
I
timeline
agree.
seemed perfect,
It suggests a much
since the
faster
Carboniferous
regeneration
era
rate
is
than
famous for having an
anticipated.
atmosphere that
conditions.
allowed
The
bugs
true
to grow
shape
to
of the fossil
horrifying
stands
sizes.
out clearer than
So,
ever. The
what do you
center
do when
is
you
a
find
giant
the biggest spider ever? You give it a killer name. They christened it Megarachne, which translates to Great Spider, and naturally, because everyone loves to be terrified, it became an instant celebrity. Before long, the Mega was popping up everywhere, museums, documentaries, you name it. It even hit store shelves. But for all the hype, not everyone was buying it. Aside from the sheer size, this thing had some seriously weird quirks. For starters, the carapace was split into front and back sections by a suture, and it rocked these shovel-shaped chelicerae features totally unheard of in the spider world. Still, most people just shrugged those red flags off. The logic? It's probably just a weird new order of arachnid, or maybe a complete evolutionary one-off. Proving otherwise was a nightmare. Though, since the original fossil, the holotype, was locked tight in a bank vault, leaving the skeptics with nothing but plaster casts to squint at. So, that's where things stood for 25 years. Then, in 2005, luck struck. A second specimen turned up, and given the matching carapace and legs, it was definitely our friend Mega. This new find was way more complete. Which sounds fantastic, right? Well, actually, it opened a massive can of worms. Once researchers really started digging into the details, they realized the tergites and legs were dead ringers for a completely different extinct group. Except this group wasn't spiders. It was sea scorpions. To be specific, asterisk Megarachne times looked almost exactly like times Woodwardopterus asterisk, a decent-sized eurypterid from the Permo-Carboniferous period. And just like that, the penny dropped. The world's biggest, baddest spider wasn't a spider at all. Pretty big oopsie, considering sea scorpions aren't even arachnids. To be fair, it wasn't a totally crazy guess. Sea scorpions and arachnids aren't the same, but in the grand scheme of prehistoric beasts, they're basically cousins. And look, if you squint at that original fossil, it does kind of look like a spider, sort of. But swallowing the truth? That was a tough pill to swallow, especially for the museums that dropped serious cash on fancy giant spider exhibits. Honestly, you can still find places displaying it as a spider today, mostly because, well, no refunds on expensive models. But you know what doesn't cost a dime? Smashing that like button and subscribing. It seriously helps the channel grow, so I can keep bringing you guys more cool stories. Anyway, back to the science. We now picture times Megarachne times as a medium-sized eurypterid hanging out in massive freshwater floodplains, using rake-like arms to sift through the mud for small invertebrates. A far cry from the original nightmare fuel of stalking through dense forests hunting for prey. It's pretty rare to get the animal's identity wrong times and times, completely botch its entire ecosystem at the same time. But honestly, I wouldn't say the times Megarachne times mix-up is the worst one out there. There's a dinosaur contender that beats it one way, more famous than times Megalosaurus asterisk asterisk, Therizinosaurus asterisk. Thanks to times Jurassic World asterisk, pretty much everyone recognizes this guy by name. And let's be real, it's hard to forget a face or hands like that, with those insane claws. But believe it or not, it wasn't always the Wolverine dinosaur. Originally, it wasn't even classified as a dinosaur. They thought it was a turtle. Yeah, a turtle. You really have to wonder how we got from point A to point B on that one. To figure that out, we need to rewind to the 1940s. Paleontology had improved since the 1800s, sure, but there were still plenty of gaps. The Soviet Union was funding a ton of expeditions to flex their scientific muscles, and the Gobi Desert was the place to be an absolute goldmine for fossils. Then, in 1948, a team stumbled onto something massive. Amidst a pile of dinosaur and turtle bones, they found these gigantic claws. Nothing like them had ever been seen before. We're talking the biggest claws ever discovered at that time, each one roughly 3 feet, or 1 meter long. They were found right near a large theropod body, and some random, unidentified ribs and vertebrae. Here's the kicker, though. The paleontologists decided the theropod body had nothing to do with the claws. And those random bone fragments? Total mystery. So, staring at just these enormous hooks, they were scratching their heads. But, since the Nemegt Formation was full of river systems and teeming with turtles, a scientist named Evgeny Malev had a light bulb moment. He proposed a wild theory. These claws actually belonged to a gigantic aquatic turtle. A turtle that was 4.5 meters or 15 feet long and weighed over a ton. Imagine that swimming at you with those scythes. But thankfully, he wasn't picturing a killer turtle. His theory was that this behemoth used those massive claws like giant rakes to harvest huge piles of tasty seaweed. And while this turtle phase might be news to you, the weird road to identifying times Therizinosaurus times isn't exactly a secret. You might be surprised to learn that its full scientific name, Therizinosaurus chelonoformis, literally translates to turtle-like scythe lizard. But looking at it now, it's pretty clear we aren't dealing with a turtle. So how did we get that wrong? Well, eventually, the fossilized remains got a second look from a paleontologist who realized those strange claws resembled those of other extinct species, just on a much more massive scale. What really caught his attention, though, was that the creature sporting the most similar claws wasn't a reptile in a shell, but a large theropod. He specifically drew comparisons to Chilentesaurus, a carnivorous dinosaur from China. This sparked the revolutionary theory that our mysterious turtle was actually a dinosaur. And sure enough, that theory held water when more giant claws were discovered. Only this time, they were attached to a lot more of the skeleton, including parts of the legs, arms, and ribs. That sealed the deal. It was definitely a theropod. Yet for all its fame, Therizinosaurus still keeps some secrets, specifically regarding those massive claws. Experts still argue about their function, proposing everything from self-defense and digging to pulling down branches or even climbing trees. Some even suggest they were purely for display, basically just for show. But hey, at least we've ruled out the turtle theory. Still, it's fascinating to look back at how we used to imagine these iconic beasts. And Therizinosaurus wasn't the only one to suffer an identity crisis. The same thing happened to an even more famous creature, Pterodactylus. Now, while the specific genus might not ring a bell for everyone, you'd almost certainly recognize it as a pterosaur.
Showing
These flying
every tiny
reptiles are
joint
so
imprinted on
synonymous
the
with the
limestone.
dinosaur age that they're household names even if you've never cracked open a fossil book. Fun fact, the entire order of pterosaurs was actually named after the Pterodactylus, because it was the very first one science ever stumbled across. The oldest fossils popped up way back in the late 1700s in Bavarian limestone, long before the word dinosaur was even coined. All things considered, the specimen was in spectacular condition, with the skeleton largely complete, which is practically a miracle given that pterosaurs had delicate,
The deep
hollow
sea
bones
jellyfish
that rarely
swims
survived the
gracefully,
fossilization
its
process.
enormous membrane
Despite having
continuously
such a great
fluttering
specimen,
open and closed
the first
in the dark
researcher
water.
to analyze it, Cosimo Collini, completely missed the mark. He was so baffled by the creature's bizarre anatomy that he concluded it must be a marine animal. In his defense, the ocean is known for hosting some pretty alien-looking life forms. Based on that hunch, he tried to rationalize how a pterosaur's body would work for swimming, even though it was visibly ill-equipped for a life aquatic. But he stuck to his guns, arguing that what
This
looked like
horizontal
wings were
sketch
actually
illustrates
massive,
our
elongated
hypothesis.
flippers,
The
which the
highlighted
creature
long finger
supposedly used to paddle through the depths. He was convinced it lived entirely underwater. Others took a middle ground, suggesting it was amphibious, living somewhat like a seal, splitting time between surf and turf.
This is the French
Beyond
naturalist
that,
Georges
Collini
Cuvier,
was stumped,
whose work
failing to classify
revolutionized
it
the
as a
study
reptile,
of fossils in the
mammal,
late
or
18th
anything
and
else
early
specific.
19th centuries.
Ironically, the one thing he was sure of was that it had no relation to bats or birds. Since the fossil was so well preserved, however, it didn't take long for the aquatic theory to start leaking. By the early 1800s, experts noted the creature had elongated fingers that likely supported a wing membrane, drawing parallels to bat anatomy. This marked the first time anyone seriously considered that these animals could fly. But as you can tell from early sketches, they still didn't quite have the full picture. That drawing was a game changer though, because it ended up on the desk of Georges Cuvier, who was intrigued enough to examine the fossil himself. This led him to officially describe the animal in 1809, dubbing it Pterodactylus, or wing finger. It was a solid start, but the scientific community was still squabbling over what it
Life
actually was.
exploded in the Cambrian
Some insisted
period.
it was a bat,
This
while others thought it
remarkable
was some
fossil
strange
shows
missing link
Anomalocharus,
between mammals
an
and
early-
birds. Cuvier, meanwhile, correctly identified it as a reptile, a fact that would be proven later as more pterosaur discoveries came to light. While the debate over its ability to fly was settled fairly quickly, the shadow of its aquatic past lingered. It wasn't until the 1830s that the consensus finally shifted, and paleontologists agreed that pterosaurs were masters of the sky, not the sea. Although, ironically enough, modern research suggests some pterosaur species actually were decent swimmers. Today, we understand Pterodactylus as a relatively small pterosaur that hunted small prey across Jurassic Europe. And while it may not have been a creature of the deep, its history is certainly deep with twists and turns. Turns out, it actually loved the water, hanging out in super salty lagoons where food was plentiful. Now, mistaking one animal for another is a classic blunder, but looking at a single skeleton and seeing three completely different species, that is a special kind of mess. Let me introduce you to Exhibit A. Asterisk Anomalocharus asterisk. Even with modern science clearing things up, this thing is still pure nightmare fuel. Seriously, just look at it. It shouldn't shock you that this guy hails from the Cambrian explosion, a time when evolution was basically throwing spaghetti at the wall. Back then, it was the big cheese, arguably the planet's very first apex predator, and a giant among the small fry of that era. It was massive for its time and built to kill, rocking some serious carnivorous gear. However, when the first fossils popped up in 1892, nobody guessed apex predator. In fact, They didn't even think it was times and a times animal. They thought it was a collection of them. 3 separate critters, to be exact. Like a lot of these oddballs, the holotype was pulled from Canada's famous Burgess Shale. Researchers found a mouth part, some grabby front claws, and a torso. Since they belonged to the same beast, naturally, they were all lying right next to each other. But because times Anomalocaris times looks like a fever dream assembled by a toddler, scientists didn't realize they were looking at a single entity. Instead, they were convinced the body was a sea cucumber, the claws were the tail of a shrimp, and that circular mouth was a jellyfish. Here's the kicker, though. They were super smug about it, too. To them, it was the only explanation that made any sense. You can picture the confusion when they kept digging and finding these specific species together over and over again. I mean, what are the odds of a jellyfish, a shrimp, and a sea cucumber forming a suicide pact in the exact same spot every time? The answer? They weren't friends. They were parts of the same body. While the 3 friends theory is cute, the reality of times, Anomalocaris times, is way more metal. It remains one of the weirdest things to ever swim in the ocean. It belongs to the radiodonts, a group of stem arthropods that are long gone. So, nope, not a shrimp, not a jelly, and definitely not a cucumber. But that initial case of mistaken identity sort of stuck. People still say it looks like a mutant prawn, and its name literally translates to unusual shrimp. Fair enough, since radiodonts are technically distant cousins to modern crustaceans anyway. It certainly lives up to the unusual label. But times Anomalocaris times isn't the only fossil that duped the experts. There is a dinosaur that held the title for world's weirdest lizard for ages because of a similar mix-up. Usually, the problem is misreading the bones you have. This time, the mystery came from what was missing. Enter the one-of-a-kind times Deinocheirus asterisk. Nowadays, asterisk Deinocheirus times is hard to ignore. It looks like a giant, terrifying duck with Freddy Krueger claws. But back in the day, it was a ghost. We only had a few pieces of the puzzle. Much like times Therizinosaurus asterisk, this beast was pulled from the Nemegt Formation. Scientists stumbled across some gnarly forelimbs, a shoulder girdle, and a few ribs. Everything was massive. We are talking the biggest arms on any bipedal animal ever found at that time. It rocked some serious claws, too. But that was it. No head, no tail, no legs. Paleontologists were left scratching their heads. And you can't really blame them. Finding giant monster arms in the middle of the desert with no body attached? That is spooky. With 0 leads, they just announced that a massive dinosaur, probably a theropod, roamed the Cretaceous.
These incredibly strong
it had insane reach and killer hooks,
dorsal structure,
earning it the name times Deinocheirus
adaptation we've
that
rarely
translates
seen.
to terrible hand. Sure, partial fossils are common, but rarely are they this teasing. What is worse is how long the mystery dragged on. Follow-up digs turned up absolutely nothing. The creature became an urban legend in the bone hunting community, enigmatic, elusive, and downright bizarre. It even ended up as a star attraction in traveling exhibitions. This guessing game went on for decades, spawning all sorts of wild theories. The scariest theory? A T-Rex-sized superpredator that sliced and diced its way across the landscape. Others pictured a giant, goofy sloth dino that just used those claws to pull down branches and snack on tree-dwelling critters. Meanwhile, a third theory went full sci-fi horror, suggesting the creature was basically a prehistoric Slenderman. The idea was that those massive arms were superpowered weapons designed to snatch up prey and crush them into a pulp. Sounds absolutely bonkers, right? But despite all the wild guesses, the bottom line didn't change. Nobody had a clue what this thing actually was, leading to decades of wrong turns. However, nearly 50 years after the first bones were found, paleontologists finally caught a lucky break in 2013. That's when a new, much more complete skeleton was unearthed, finally solving the mystery. But honestly, one look at the reconstruction, and you realize the truth was even weirder than the fiction. It turned out to be a colossal ornithomimosaur, think ostrich dinosaur, equipped with a duckbill, nightmarish claws, and a massive hump on its back. It's a design only a mother could love. And while it looks terrifying, the evidence suggests that Deinocheirus was actually a gentle giant, despite those Wolverine-style claws. See, those nails were blunt, not sharp, which means they were likely used for digging up roots and gathering vegetation, rather than slicing up other dinosaurs. On top of that, its skull was built for stripping plants, not tearing through flesh. But nature rarely deals in absolutes. A later specimen threw a wrench in the works when researchers found fish scales preserved right where its stomach used to be, suggesting this beast was actually an omnivore and a massive one at that. In fact, it's now crowned as the largest ornithomimosaur to ever walk the earth. It even holds its own among the biggest theropods in history, with some individuals stretching 11 meters, that's 36 feet, and weighing in at a hefty 6.5 tons. Some experts even suspect it could have tipped the scales at over 10 tons. It just goes to show that paleontology isn't an exact science. Fossils can be misleading, especially when the remains are fragmentary or just plain confusing to the people digging them up. But mistakes don't just happen when we find bones, they happen when we times. Don't times find them too? There's actually a specific term for this, the Lazarus taxon. This refers to a species that vanishes from the fossil record, presumed dead, only to miraculously reappear later, leaving scientists completely baffled. The most famous example of this involves a very specific fish, one that is, surprisingly, still swimming around today. I know, this channel is usually about extinct creatures, but this story is too good to skip. It perfectly highlights the problem. We were convinced this thing had been gone for 66 million years. It started back in the 18th century, when paleontologists began uncovering a distinct type of fish in rock layers across the globe. The first find came from Europe, dating back to the late Permian. We're talking more than 250 million years ago. It was a modest-sized creature, but unique enough to establish an entire new group,
I am
the
not
Coelacanths.
repeating myself.
Now,
You
visually,
hear me?
that first fossil wasn't exactly a showstopper, but it grabbed the scientific community's attention for two main reasons. First, its extreme age, and second, it looked like a missing link, a transitional species bridging the gap between fish and land-dwelling tetrapods. Researchers also realized this fish was an absolute survivor. Cousins of that original specimen kept popping up in geological formations from the Devonian, the Jurassic, and beyond. While the general public usually snoozes over fish fossils, a few finds were impressive enough to turn heads like the Jurassic giant Mawsonia. This aquatic tank could grow up to 5.3 meters, about 17.4 feet, and survived by crushing hard-shelled prey or vacuuming up anything unfortunate enough to get too close. Along with its smaller relatives, this behemoth seemed to be a staple of prehistoric marine life. Then, they just vanished. The fossil trail went cold exactly 66 million years ago, right at the KT extinction boundary. It seemed like an open and shut case. The coelacanths had met the same fiery end as the non-avian dinosaurs. But history loves a plot twist. In 1938, off the eastern coast of South Africa, a local crew was out trawling for the day's catch. When they returned to shore after a long shift, the boat's captain decided to call up a local museum curator. He mentioned his crew had hauled in some oddities that might look good on display. So, the curator drove down to the docks to inspect the catch, which turned out to be a big pile of sharks. But poking out from the heap was a strange blue fin. When she cleared the pile, she revealed a massive fish, about 5 feet or 1.5 meters long, that looked completely alien compared to anything she'd encountered before. Even the captain was stumped. In 30 years of fishing these waters, he'd never seen a creature like it. Sensing she had something significant on her hands, she secured the specimen and fired off a letter to a prominent scientist to describe the discovery, noting that the fish was encased in heavy, armor-like scales and possessed fins that looked suspiciously like limbs, trailing off into a fringe of filaments. To make sure he understood what she was looking at, she included a rough sketch. It took nearly 2 weeks for the letter to reach J. L. B. Smith. When he finally saw that drawing, he essentially had the academic equivalent of a heart attack. To his trained eye, this wasn't a modern fish, it was a ghost from the fossil record. Fighting back the shock, he tried to keep his cool. He immediately replied, emphasizing in all caps that she needed to preserve that specimen at all costs. Eventually, she managed to ship him a few tiny fragments, and for him, that was the smoking gun that proved his wildest fantasy was real. We are talking about a coelacanth here, a creature supposed to have vanished 66 million years ago, suddenly back from the dead. When he finally stood face to face with the beast, he described the feeling like a white-hot explosion going off, leaving
What do we have underneath here?
ecstatic and vibrating with pure adrenaline. It sounds a bit intense.
It appears to be
but
undamaged.
for a fossil hunter staring at a living legend like the Latimeria,
Look at the density
it
here.
makes total sense.
The eye is completely
As you can
opaque.
imagine,
Cellular
this
breakdown
discovery
is
blew
extensive.
everyone's minds.
Consistent
It
with
kicked
the
off
others
a
we
massive
found.
treasure hunt that uncovered not just more of them, but a second species entirely. Today, we know them as the West Indian Ocean and Indonesian coelacanths. Just like their prehistoric cousins, the modern versions are absolute tanks. They can grow up to 2 meters long, that is over 6.5 feet, and weigh in at a hefty 90 kilograms, or 200 pounds. What is even wilder is their lifespan. These guys can stick around for a century, and since they are, not extinct, we have had the chance to really look under the hood, even mapping out their entire genetic code. That research actually busted a major myth. We used to think coelacanths were the closest evolutionary link to land animals, but it turns out the humble lungfish actually wears that crown. And surprisingly, or maybe not, if you get how nature works, we learned that coelacanths did not just hit the pause button. They are still evolving to this day. Sure, on the surface they look like prehistoric photocopies, which is fair given they have been around for eons. But honestly, it really should not shock us that ancient monsters like the Coelacanth are still patrolling the deep, especially when you realize we have only mapped about 20% of our own oceans. And the stuff we have found in that tiny slice? Absolutely insane. I actually broke down some of those underwater oddities in a video on my other channel,
When we think of deep-sea creatures,
so,
we imagine
if you want to
darkness,
deep dive into the massive giants
giant
lurking in the
neon
abyss,
jellyfish
go give that a
lights
look.
up the
I will pop the link right up here, I think. Anyway, thanks for hanging out.